You're listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we're listening to a virtual session from Winter Institute 2022, Diversity and Inclusion Matters in Your Store, a DEI store audit to walk the talk.
The goal today is to kind of help us walk through what are some things that people should do? What are the expectations? If we're supposed to be intentional, what does it mean? What are the things we should be doing? And so here's a question I would have for you when you think about the context of diversity, equity, inclusion is, should religion be discussed at work? Yes, no, maybe. How many people think religion should be discussed at work? A few yeses. No, yes, not sure, not sure. Yes, but there's quite a few, right? Depends on the job, depends on context. Why not? Excellent. So here's the next question. Should your organization make statements about voting rights in Georgia? Yes, no, maybe. Should your organization make statements about violence directed towards the Asian Pacific Islander community? Yes, no. Quite a few yeses. Here's the next statement. Should your organization make statements about heritage months? And if so, which ones? Heritage months being, this is Black History Month right now. When it's Pride, do you make a statement? Yes. Yes to all of them. Excellent. Nothing will change if we don't speak up. Excellent. This one, should your organization make statements about George Floyd? Yes, most people think we should. How about, should your organization celebrate and or make statements about Juneteenth, Ramadan, Christmas, Hanukkah? Excellent. It says making displays and educating the community is how we make statements. Excellent. Celebrating is tricky, but statements seem appropriate. And celebration is interesting, right? Those are actually be two different things, celebrating and whether or not you make a statement. So as I mentioned, I've been doing diversity for probably 25 years. And the short answer is, I don't know the answer to this question for you. It depends. And what it depends on are a couple things I find when most companies start to struggle in this space. One is, what are your definitions? Have you defined diversity, equity, and inclusion? And do you have policies? And many organizations don't actually stop to do that. And that's why they struggle in this space. The next thing I always tell people, and I'll explain all these in a minute in an actual example, but the question that I would ask is, when you do have definitions, do you include things like reflect the world or tension? And tension is important because a lot of times people think, oh, we do diversity and inclusion. That means there'll be no tension. That means, and in fact, I would suggest it means the opposite. When you have good inclusion and you have diversity, it means people are going to disagree. And in fact, many cases when I've done diversity work as a consultant, and we ask questions and you get nothing but silence, typically means something's broken. People do not feel empowered to speak up. That is generally not a good thing. So the fact you have diversity and people are disagreeing is actually a good thing. It means it's working, right? I like this. Should is not a word I like. For this, I think it's a matter of what we feel comfortable with and how we do it. Is it respectful? Is it accurate? Is it forced? These are all good points. And I think the other thing I would add here is this next question, which is diversity and inclusion doesn't mean people won't disagree, because usually that's what people want. They want the tension to go away. And they think, oh, if we do this well, there'll be no tension. And it actually doesn't mean that. So the other thing I would say, and this has kind of been said, is you can't ignore it though. That's not one of our realities, right? You can't just ignore this and hope that it goes away. I see safety is another word too. And that's one of the things too, I think we should think about, even the words we choose, right? Do we want to create a safe space? And I've stopped using safe space. And the reason I have is because talking about race is not unsafe, right? That I think actually what people want is a place that they feel included and valued. But we should not tie this dynamic that somehow when you talk about race, you are physically unsafe. You are uncomfortable is what's going on, because we typically don't talk about race. We typically don't talk about politics. And to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, what do? We ask you to talk about race and politics at the same time, which are things we're told we should never do. As a result, you're uncomfortable. It's not that you are unsafe, because I think what it starts to do is draw a line that somehow people of color are therefore unsafe, because talking about issues that might impact a person of color or a person who's from the LGBTQ community or gender, that these things are unsafe, and they are not unsafe. It is uncomfortable. That's the normal process, but you are actually not unsafe. And so sometimes I think the words that we use are important in how we begin to frame things. So if we're supposed to move forward and we're trying to define how we move forward, I always tell people, and this is something most people don't do, is have you ever stopped to define what you mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I find a lot of companies don't do that, and they don't align their vision and mission with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they struggle with answering, oh, there's something going on with voting rights in Georgia. What should we do? Should I make a statement? Should we become active and not sure what they should do? So that's why it's important to come up with some definitions, so that it helps begin framing the conversation. And it gives you a way to explain to your customers, why are we doing this? Because this will begin centering the conversation. So I don't know if there's something in the chat, Stephanie, that I maybe should pause and address at this point. I saw quite a bit of action there, or I can just pause if someone wants to come off and ask the question before I get to begin answering these next questions. I want to make sure that I haven't missed something that was really important.
There aren't any questions in the chat right now. There are a couple of comments. Bobby Lee says, I believe that comfortable spaces are mistaken for safe spaces. In reality, safe spaces are often uncomfortable because you're learning and challenging beliefs. It's not attacking, but wrestling with uncomfortable things with people you trust. Ivy Stevens says, if you have ways for staff to feel physically safe speaking out, then speaking out is easier. And Paula says, I would go so far as to say that emotional and mental safety is also important.
Yeah, I think it's always important. We don't want to injure other people with our words. So I hear that, and I think that's fair. I just think we should also think about the words we choose to use when we frame conversations, because it does, I think, begin to have people think about what they're saying and what the words and how they impact the community. So, but here it's important to pause for a minute and define diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, you don't have to use my definitions, but for our conversation today, and I'll also then give an example of how this works and why I think it's important to start here. So first, when I think of diversity on a very simple level, I just think of it's what we look like. It's the things you can visually see. Typically, that's what people think of diversity. Now, diversity can be broader than that, but it's a simple way for people to remember. And I think that's important because for generally when I work in companies, for people to start understanding it, you have to give them simple ways to start connecting to it. And then you can start having more and more complicated conversations, but you have to start at a place. It's just like anything else. You don't start with calculus. But many times what we do is because we haven't paused to define these terms, and it becomes too embarrassing to say out loud, I don't know what it means, that everyone starts moving with these different assumptions. And it generally, what I find is it actually creates the very tension you're trying to avoid. And so it's important to pause for a moment and say, okay, as an organization, how do we define diversity? What does that mean? The next thing is equity. And I always try to think of equity, again, you can disagree, but for this conversation is how we treat each other. And it's also thinking about the barriers, whether intentional or unintentional, that we create for people to participate. And how do we create equity in that context? So again, this is the treatment. And then I always think of inclusion as this is why we stay. If you feel people are making you feel welcomed and valued, they're probably going to stay. Equity to me sometimes also speaks to this concept of, are we all being paid fairly? All right, that's the equity piece. And if I am paid fairly, I probably will stay. And these are how these things are connected. Again, these don't have to be the definitions that you use, but for me, generally what I try to do is let's have this first fundamental conversation. The next thing I always tell people is you have to be able to align your diversity statement and your beliefs with the organization. And so I'll give some examples of this because this is another place that I think people miss. And as a result, they really struggle with their diversity work. Now here you can see, I actually work at Western Governors University. And so Their mission is to change lives for the better by creating pathways to opportunity. Their vision statement is to be the most student-centric university. And then you can see these are their cultural beliefs, their key results. But what is the vision statement for diversity? We're endeavoring to be the world's most inclusive university. So with that simple phrase, what we're hoping to help employees understand is, how do I then align myself with what the organization is trying to achieve? What are we doing? We're endeavoring to be the world's most inclusive university. That's why we create accessibility. That's why we have closed captioning, right? That's what we do to be inclusive. And when we are inclusive, that's how we change lives for the better. That's the mission. And that's how we're student-centric. And this is important. And the reason I say it is I worked with a hospital system, and their CEO is getting a lot of pressure to put out more statements around diversity. You know, employees were asking, well, why don't you make a statement about voting rights in Georgia? And she felt like, well, because that's not what we do. And I said, well, what's your vision and mission statement? Well, she said, well, I guess we hadn't thought about that. And she said, well, our vision and our mission is to be, and this was in Colorado, like the health provider of choice in Colorado. All right, and I was like, well, that makes sense then, because you can then tell employees the reason we don't make statements about voting rights in Georgia is because we're about what happens in Colorado. Doesn't mean we don't care. And there will be some things that raise to the level of, well, George Floyd is something we felt we had to speak on. That makes sense. But it means when employees ask you, why did we not make a statement about voting rights in Georgia? You can answer that question. Not that we don't care, but we're about health care in Colorado. That makes sense. They can align to that. And what I found is by doing that, it therefore actually makes it easier to do your diversity and inclusion work, because you're aligning these things. You can clearly state what you do and what you don't do. And therefore, when you do, if you want to recognize Heritage Months, it's Black History Month, you can also have a better thing. So yeah, we're really trying to focus on healthcare because we're a healthcare system during Black History Month. That's how we separate our mission and separate what we do for our audience. And so that's one of the reasons I would say, even though that's, again, I can be overly practical, and I know that, but that's one of the reasons I try to make sure we talk about it in a way that makes sense to employees and hopefully help people connect and align it. So then the diversity work starts to make sense. Why are we doing this? Employees can make sense of it and see how they align with it. Okay, yeah, I see a couple people have said, can you have access to the slides? Yes, please. We will do our best to get those to you. And these slides, hopefully are helpful to you, and we can just send those out if you want. That's fine. So the goal here again is, right, we got to have our definitions, and we got to think about our mission and vision alignment. So therefore, hopefully it makes it easier for you to answer, yeah, this is why we're doing this particular event on this particular day, because it aligns with our vision. So if it's, our bookstore just feels like we are part of how we, push inclusion within our community, makes sense. That's why we're doing it, because we're trying to include it within our community or in the larger context of our state or whatever, but hopefully starts giving you a way to explain what you're doing. And more importantly, employees know what to do. Why am I doing this? This makes sense. So this is, again, a little bit about a visual about when you think about what is it I can actually do as a store owner or business owner, is you actually control a few variables. One is who gets hired, who gets promoted, who stays, who leaves, and how customers are treated. And my example here was one that was actually shared with me. And this might be before many people remember this, but there was another unfortunate episode where Rodney King was beaten by police and it was videotaped. And after that, there was a riot in LA. Most people are familiar with the LA riots. One of the things most people don't realize is that, during the riot, a lot of businesses were burned down, but not one McDonald's was burned down in that community in 1992. Now, what's interesting about that is, to me, even though it wasn't necessarily done under the context of we're about diversity and inclusion, but at that time, Ray Kroc basically said he really very much believed in investing in your community, and that it was a trust bank, and that if you could get your customers to feel like we are part of each other's family and that we trust each other, that you would get this outcome, which would be better, you'd be better received and people would accept you. And that's exactly what happened. Because as people were literally rioting and burning businesses down, not one McDonald's was touched. And to me, that's the outcome of controlling who got hired, who got promoted, managing who stays, treating customers well, That's the diversity and inclusion, and doing it in a way that respects them and their experience. And that's what he was able to do. Now, and I assume people probably have issues with McDonald's now, so this is no endorsement of McDonald's necessarily, but I just wanted to use the example of when every employee knows what the vision of the organization is, how they intersect with it, that you can execute on it and get the kind of return that most people want from a diversity and inclusion. And that's why I think the definitions are important. The vision statement is important to help people align with it, whether they work for you or they're your customer, because then it makes sense to them, right? So the other thing I was asked to do is actually give an explanation of how we'd actually build a diversity plan around what I just shared with you. And you actually get this template. I believe it's already been shared. This is one that's already completed. And Gales is a very small company. And so they're actually a client, if you will, that we worked with. And this is a lot of this is outlined in the book. But I'll walk through it. You get this template. And you're talking about a company, I don't think they even had 10 employees. But this is the diversity plan they built. Very practical and very actionable. Because I think a lot of times what happens is with diversity and inclusion, we try to fix too much and we fix it. And therefore we become overwhelmed. We're boiling the ocean. And there are little simple practical things we should do on a regular basis. And I'll give some examples and walk you through this. And if you have questions, feel free to ask the questions. But this is kind of the page one. You'll see it's pretty direct. Basically, who's the CEO? But the one thing I would point out is it says, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but it says diversity lead. This is important to identify who's going to do this. This is a thing I find often what will happen is people say, oh, let's put together a committee. I don't necessarily have problems with committees. You'll see I'll outline quite a bit of this in the book. But what happens is if someone isn't individually responsible, it generally doesn't get done. Because everyone in the committee will go, well, yeah, I think it's a great idea. And here's my idea, but I have to do this today. And so it always gets deprioritized. And so you have to start identifying who's actually going to do this. And there'll be some other locations where I highlight this again, but this is a really important point that a committee will be useless if no individuals are responsible for anything. So it's important to identify that. And this is kind of their why. So you see, like we asked them just a quick sentence about what's important to you, why are you doing this? Create your vision and mission statement. I explain why that's important. And so what we try to do is you have your mission already established for the company, and then what is the D&I statement? And there should be some intersection between those two. What I found is companies will struggle when they can't find that intersection. Like if this is our vision of the organization and diversity seems disconnected, people will never do it because it doesn't make sense. They're disconnected. And so trying to find a way to create an intersection between those two is very important. This is, again, I am overly practical. This is just a list of 3 things that you probably should do. And this is why these are just typed in. They're not like questions or statements. You should just review your content, whether it's website, social media, to ensure that it reflects the diversity that you think is important. So if you say diversity is important to us as an organization, that it's a simple thing you can do. Well, we look at our website, we look at how we message, and make sure that's reflected in our message. And then again, if you do have a vision and mission statement, you should put it on your website. People should know that's important. And the reason being is if someone's looking up, well, it's interesting, the bookstore says they're part of a community, but they never make a statement, then you can point to, well, this is why we didn't talk about voting rights in Georgia, is because our mission statement says X. And so they can see that. I always say audio should match video. You'll see that in the book too, right? Audio has to match video. And then if you do have a plan or establish some goals, I would put them on your website too, right? That's holding ourselves accountable here. Here, there's a page in there you'll see that's just for definitions. We wrote these in here. These are not necessarily, you don't have to use them. They're just an example for you to see. And I try to highlight why I think that's important, that you should define these things so everyone's on the same page. So here is just a quick workshop. You'll actually get this. It's a worksheet that will outline how to think about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I always tell people diversity basically comes down to 3 things. You're recruiting people or customers, you're trying to retain them, and it's thought leadership. Pretty much almost everything falls into that category. Again, I tend to be overly practical and simple, but these things have helped me over the years. And so you can see, this is their actual plan. We've sat down with them and we use this exact template. You'll have a copy of this. It's in the book. It outlines it. Feel free to use this. But usually it's like, come up with the name of your program. So here's develop and post D&I vision and mission. So again, very practical. If we think a vision and mission statement is important, you should just write that out. because I think it also helps you start getting in the habit of achieving. Person responsible, like who's actually going to make sure this happens. And then we think of, who's the audience? And we say area of focus, but this is something we think is important for our board or all our staff, our part-time. It's important for our community. And then we think of the target demographic in the sense, in some cases, depending on the initiative, it might only be about race. Other cases, maybe it's about gender, maybe it's about women. So it's start highlighting it. Oh, we're really trying to make sure we reach people with disabilities. And then we try to tell people you should have a start date and end date. And then you just clearly say, what are we going to do? Make sure that this is stated on our website. All right, pretty simple. But any company, regardless of size, could do these things. Something that could easily be done. And it'll help you in the future. Here's the next thing. This is what could you do for recruitment? This goes back to a study that happened. It was in the Harvard Business Review. And there's a study that says, if you only interview one woman, the odds of her being hired is 0. And so they did some research and they found that when there were 3 candidates and 1 woman, the odds of hiring the woman was literally 0. If there were 4 candidates and 2 women, the odds of hiring a woman is 50%, which is what it should be. And so we actually use this 4 to 50 technique when I worked at the US Olympic Committee. And it was very targeted. And so we always tried to make sure when we were hiring at someone at director and above, you're talking about an organization of 400 employees. So it wasn't like, I think there was like 5 or 8 hires that year at director and above. It was very targeted, but we felt like the organization had a glass ceiling and we wanted to intentionally break that glass ceiling. And so we told people if it's a director level job, you have to have 4 candidates, 2 diverse, 2 non-diverse. And by that simple process, we increased the hiring of women and people of color by like 60 or 70%, right? So the research showed, and I see somebody pointed this out, is if there were 4 candidates and you got gender balance, somehow psychologically people started thinking, oh, all the candidates are now equal. But when the candidates are outnumbered, the assumption was that person is actually not qualified. They're just a token. And you can see the NFL is actually struggling with this right now, right? They have this Rooney Rule that requires 1 person of color to be interviewed. And all the emphasis is on, well, do we process not outcomes? And so what we're trying to do is move it to outcomes and how do we actually remove bias? Because that's the intended goal, is to remove bias. So it's actually a very interesting study how they constructed it and and we actually got very good outcomes from using this very simple thing. So even if you don't hire a lot, the goal here is to say, but if we do have an opportunity to hire, how do we remove bias? So you don't have to use this technique, but begin thinking about, it's not necessarily that you can automatically remove bias, but you should be thinking about, okay, what are the processes that we could actually implement to remove bias if that's the goal? I don't know if there's any questions yet. I'll pause there.
Clara just asked, where was the hiring study from?
My understanding is they researched a couple of companies and looked at their data. So they looked at the number, who was employed and who was interviewed and who was hired. And so they did it based, and I don't know what all the companies were. I believe you can actually just look it up. And I think it was called, if there's only 1 woman, odds of her hired is 0. I think that's actually the title of it. It was in the Harvard Business Review. Any other questions?
Nope,
Oh, yeah.
just put it, yep, dropped a link in the chat.
Well done. Yeah, it's an interesting quick read, actually. Very interesting. Again, but it's a good way for us to think about what's a lot of times what happens, and we'll talk about this actually in the next, this is a retention goal, right? And so I'll combine a couple things here that I think hopefully would help that can be done. One is a lot of times with diversity training, it's overwhelming. We think, oh, I don't have enough money to pay for a diversity training for everyone on my staff every month. And you're right, most people don't. Like that kind of budget is hard to do. So what we began moving towards, and this is something I do a lot now, is we will just find maybe a current event, maybe it's the renewal, and we'll have a 15-minute conversation and ask some questions. Can you see forms of bias? Can you see microaggression, right? Or just do a small, quick session on what is microaggression and defining those. And we would identify maybe a person on staff who would actually do that training. They would learn it. We just do a 5 or 10-minute thing on it at a regular cadence. Because what happens is people think, oh, we should do these mandatory trainings for 45 minutes or an hour. It doesn't work. And the reason they don't is because there's no way for you to remember all that. Like that's actually not a great teaching and learning way. If you think about if you took calculus, you didn't get one 45-minute session and go, well, your understanding calculus will now last for the rest of your life. Like that's not even sensible. But that's what we've done with diversity. We think, oh, we pay a lot for a one-time diversity training. And now you know everything you need to know about gender, race, people with disabilities, right? All the different forms of difference. And then it lasts for the rest of your life because you got that 45-minute training, right? It just doesn't work that way. What really should happen is we should introduce concepts and give you a space to practice the concept and think about the concept. So for example, one of my examples would be, we recently showed this short video. There's a company called Seed and Spark, and we actually use a lot of their content. And within that context, there's a short episode of this woman gets up, and the first call she gets is the daycare provider says, I can't come watch your child. She calls a few people, nobody can come. She gets in the car with the child and she goes to an interview, right? And then she leaves the kid in the car and does the interview. And the police come. So when she comes back out, somebody saw her kids in the car. They call the police, and you can see a little bit of a conversation, and that's it. No answers. But what it does is hopefully get you to think about privilege and the actual experience of why might I leave my child in the car? Does it mean I don't care? It doesn't mean I got to have a job. You know, I'm basically living paycheck to paycheck. If you lose one job and the daycare provider doesn't come, how do you get to the next job? How do you get the next job in this situation? These are tough decisions that people have to make, and begins to make us think about, hopefully, if we do a book reading and we don't provide childcare, how does that impact the demographic who gets to participate? And it could be, well, my store doesn't make enough money for us to provide childcare, but what other things do we do? Do we make sure a family feels welcomed? Are we starting to think about how this person is experiencing the world? And these short episodes help us apply the learning. A lot of times we talk about diversity and inclusion and equity, but when are we given a chance to practice it? And so I've moved away from mandatory trainings to creating opportunities for people to engage in content, to apply the concept. Like we always talk about privilege, but we don't actually give persons a chance to think about it. And we don't often think about access to daycare as privilege. We don't think about how that impacts a person and their economic situation, right? Depending on how much money you have and, your family resources, it might be that risk you have to take. We've got to eat. I got to pay the bills. I just took my kid and left him in the car and hoped it would work out. All right. And so, but it gives us a chance to think about it and put those things in the context. So that's why I've moved away from these expensive major trainings, because again, usually what happens is that becomes a barrier. It doesn't become access. The other thing I did is we try to use short videos because that means our employees can watch 24 hours a day. It's not only at 10 o'clock. It could be, I'm really busy. And all we're asking is, look, you got to find 15 minutes to try to watch it or read a short thing or whatever it is we'll provide. And then we ask a couple questions. Can you see forms of microaggression in this? Can you see forms of privilege? Can you see forms of bias? 3 simple questions. And by allowing them to do that, what does it do? Gives them a chance to apply the learning. And therefore you get long-term change. And so what we're hoping to do is get long-term organizational change. So here is basically us applying this is to one of our outcomes in a simple template, right? Who's going to participate, right? So we know who the audience is. We basically do it once a month. And then again, we try to get 8 of them done and 80% of our employees participating, right? So it's not over the top, but achievable things we can do. And it helps us focus more on we can get some outcomes, and we can get a better understanding and appreciation for diversity, equity, inclusion, and help our employees from where they're at. Okay. Any other, I'll pause. I don't know if there's any comments or questions in the chat that I need to address.
So a couple comments back. Going back to the Harvard Business Review study, a couple of people are asking, is it the same for ethnicity or ability as well, that they find the 4-to-50 effect happening?
Yeah, so the study was mostly based on gender. We used it, included race. So for us, it was all forms of diversity. So at least 2 of the 4. So they had to have 4 people interviewed, and 2 had to have some form of diversity list for our goal. So it could be race, could be gender. And we were able to get outcomes from that. So the study doesn't necessarily use race. We just assumed that the application would be the same. And that's the outcome we got. Actually, we had good luck with it. It worked for us. And I believe they were going to expand that study. I actually know the person who was part of it, but I don't know if she's published it yet.
Okay, well, we'll be on the lookout for it then.
Yeah.
There's a comment actually that's really interesting that Spencer has put in. I was impressed recently by 2 Lines Press, who offered a child care stipend in addition to a travel and speaking honorarium for a conversation moderator who would have to travel from Portland to Seattle to moderate an event for one of their big authors.
Yeah. And I think it's these kind of things that we can do that we often don't think about inclusion. We don't think about equity, is providing those kind of things, and who participates and who attends our events. That many times, in fact, we did some work in India, and one of the things that brought to our attention is it was for women in entrepreneurship, and they're like, you can't do anything at night. It's not going to work. It's not safe for women to travel at night. And so we had to move them to the afternoon. But we were bringing our US mindset to, oh, that's when people get off work, and that's when we'll do this entrepreneurship thing, right? That just by simply taking a moment to understand the culture we're in and try to make sure it's inclusive. And many times the subtle changes you can make aren't that hard, right? Just to try to be inclusive and think about who's the demographic. Or the other thing is notice who's not participating. A lot of times that's the miss is if we just take a moment and say, wow, I just looked around the room and realized, I saw no women, or, there was no people of color in the room. Like there's a moment that you can even use that as a data point if that's telling us something, right? And that maybe there are actually barriers, and this is the equity piece, that are actually in place that are preventing them from participating. And a lot of it, and that's the other thing I was tell people, what's the tool everyone should know? Be present, not perfect. A lot of times you don't do a thing in the diversity space because we're afraid we're not going to be perfect. And I can tell you right now, you're not going to be perfect. I've been doing this 20 years. I get it wrong all the time. I still struggle with making sure I use they or them, the right pronouns, like these things are, and the thing is, you already have the skill to overcome that. And my example being, sometimes I call people by the wrong name and they'll tell me, actually, my name's Paul, not Adam. And I'll go, oh, I'm sorry, didn't mean that, right? You already know how to apologize. If you think about if you say, oh, I've misgendered you, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, right? Most people are like, okay, great. It's not like everyone's sitting around waiting to jump down your throat and yell at you. The fact of the matter is you already have the tool. Just be present. You're going to be uncomfortable. That's the reality of it. Like these skills are new to you. Many times we don't talk about race. We don't talk about gender. We don't talk about ability. As a result, we're not very good at it. So we feel super uncomfortable. And we become immobilize that because we want to be perfect. And you're not going to be perfect. Just own it, be uncomfortable, and use the skill you already have. We apologize and move forward, right? We have to give ourselves some grace here. This is the next thing, thought leadership. Is, a lot of times we don't often think of diversity. I'm going to go a slightly different direction this, but you should be thinking about diversity as like, what can I give to the communities I'm also trying to serve as well? Like hosting events and making your store open to communities so that the partnership works both ways, right? In this case, the other thing I think people often don't think about is, and one of the content you'll get is a list of things you can do that are no cost. So we'll provide that to you because a lot of times we think of diversity, we think, oh, I got a small budget, can't do all these things. So I really encourage people to reach out to local universities because typically, like for instance, I know that the University of Utah has a free session like every Friday. And I believe it's even online, you can even dial in. But a lot of universities have things around diversity and things that cost nothing. So in some ways it could be our commitment is that we're just going to try to attend. And that's what they chose to do, is that we want to try to go to these conferences. Some of them are low cost, especially one of the, I guess, if you will, good thing that came out of the pandemic is a lot of things moved online. And when it moved online, it lowered the cost in many cases. So that is one of the upsides. And so it just means, okay, how do I own this? How do I become more active if I'm committed to diversity and try to attend conferences and sessions like that? And the good news is, hopefully I've been brief and helpful. We try to be very practical. This, again, is the book. Almost everything I covered today is in that book. The artwork, again, is my son's. And the other, I guess, thing that's a little nerdy about there's a weird picture of me in there, but my daughter took it. And so you'll see that my entire family has participated in the book. And my wife helped me because I'm dyslexic. So she had to read every word with me out loud. So any other questions or things that I can respond to?
And if you feel comfortable, please feel free to raise your hand and come up and ask the questions yourself.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer any question, even if it wasn't technically covered in the presentation today. I'm happy to answer your questions. And you'll get a copy of the template that I shared for setting up a diversity plan. And I'm happy to answer any question that we might have. Oh, data to collect. This is a good one. And data is hard. Like I think you should actually track, even if you don't make a lot of hires, you should track race, gender, ability, if possible, LGBTQ status, if possible, of all the hires, because what you'll see is trends. Because then you can be more intentional. If you find, wow, we say we're committed to diversity, but we've never actually hired a person of color, that there's something, right? And it could be that, well, no one's applying. Well, then you know what the solution is. What do we do to identify candidates? And if you're doing nothing and just doing word of mouth, it's probably why it looks the way it does. Like, that's why I started with, you have to be intentional. That it's okay actually to talk about race and think about, okay, let's look around the office. There's really no people of color here. Let's do that. Or we see no gender diversity, or we've never hired a person with a disability. These are all data points. And a lot of times I think we overthink data, or we think over small, and what we collect. There's simple things you can do that are actually very telling. If you look around and see no people with disability, that probably tells you something. And the last time you hired, what did you do? Did you actually actively make sure that we shared information with different resources that could make sure that people with disabilities were reached? Or have you looked around your store, and part of it could be the way your store is set up is not really fully accessible. So therefore, they're not ever coming to your store in the first place. You never see them. You can kind of see how these things would then begin to connect themselves, right? So I would really encourage you to just think about that. There's some simple data points. Who comes in the store? Does it look like the people who live in your community? These are little things that you could be tracking that will tell you a lot about what the opportunity is and the way to move forward. This is actually a great question I see here. And it says, how does training differ for large organizations versus small organizations where everyone knows everyone else? I don't think it should. Like, I've been moving in this direction lately, where I think it should be short, quick trainings on a regular basis, regardless of your size. So the goal should be, how do we remove barriers to participation, right? Number one, we try to use content that's available 24 hours a day. So it's therefore not limited to when you can access it. So that removes a barrier. And if it's a 15-minute session, there's no excuse not to participate. All right, we just ask you to watch that, answer some simple questions. And then what we have been doing is we do that. We provided the 3 questions I mentioned. And then we're identifying people to facilitate the conversation, and they don't have to be perfect. We've realized there's not enough expertise for us to have an expert in every single room. We've accepted it's going to be uncomfortable, and there isn't always going to be one answer that we think is the right answer for everyone to know. And in fact, part of the process is it's clumsy, complicated. If you had talked to me 30 years ago when I was in college, I was completely homophobic. I'm a different person now. That did not happen in a 45-minute session, right? It happened through people having conversations with me growing up and working through complicated conversations. Not everyone had a perfect, pretty resolution. Actually, some of them were really ugly and complicated. But I grew up, and that's how I grew. That's the process of being uncomfortable and staying present and not trying to be perfect. And so I think regardless of size, some of the simple processes should always be the same. How do we give people enough math to do calculus? And that's the same fundamental principle. How do we give you enough information to begin going down the road and understanding issues of race, gender, privilege, ability, et cetera? Other questions?
Yeah, so we have one, how does the training differ for large organizations versus small organizations where everyone knows everyone else?
Yeah, and I think it's the same, as I mentioned. Like, it's okay. I'll just do small sessions, short bursts, remove barriers. Let's see. The next question. There was one here that caught my eye. Oh, and do I have any favorite links to short videos, workshops that you would like to? Okay, so I love YouTube. Like, you just Google race or whatever, things pop up, right? The other thing we've been using is a company called Seed and Spark. Seed and Spark is actually a lot like Netflix, but all the content is created from individuals who are from generally underrepresented groups, produced, actors, et cetera, and they're all short films. It's a small company owned by a woman, so you're supporting the arts at the same time. You're supporting a small business owner. They're growing at the same time, and it's literally like Netflix. And we literally just have a small committee that picks. We bought the service from them for our organization. We have a small committee that picks it. We typically try to align the video with whatever month it is. So Black History Month, it would typically be Black actors or Black producer, et cetera. So we support the arts at the same time. get the 3 questions. And so it's pretty simple. And we've had really good luck with it. It's relatively low lift, not super expensive, but allows us to continue to have the conversations. And that's what I think that the emphasis should be around. Other questions? Stephanie, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Besides hiring, what are some other areas of small business that are important to look at for DEI?
Yeah, I think you're the perfect place to host great conversations. You have all the content, obviously, great content. And I think we should also think about diversity. Many times we think about it only in the context of, is this a problem, instead of how do we also just raise the voices around, because many times we see people of color very one-dimensional, or women as one-dimensional, instead of like, sometimes it's just a great conversation about a writer, right? And for instance, we teach the concepts and we bring in different speakers periodically. And sometimes we'll talk about microaggression, that's the point of it. And then other times we have somebody who just tells their story. So we'll bring in, for instance, in the past, we've brought in like a Paralympian. It's by definition, their story is going to include diversity. They're going to share that, but we tell it in a way that's very human. And so it doesn't feel like, oh, it's always preaching to us what we're supposed to do. It's just like, no, you should be able to apply the learnings to this person when they share their experience with you. Is it the context of bias that they experience when they're sharing? Is it privilege? And so we really try to use different ways to deliver the information. But the goal should be creating opportunities for people to practice the concepts. We spent too much time giving you one concept and never an opportunity to practice or learn through it.
Okay, so we have one that has been kind of seconded by a couple of people. Do you have any suggestions on an action that could be taken to increase ethnic diversity in a hiring pool, such as, where to reach out, verbiage to use, different platforms, etc.?
Yeah, I think one easy thing is almost every university has a diversity officer. And so if there's one that's local or regional, I will reach out to them. Because basically what universities do, they help you find candidates. These people. And so that's one simple thing that's very low cost that can be done, is reach out to universities. The other thing is, if you can't attend conferences, I always say, because what you're trying to do is expand your network. A lot of times too, what I find is people struggle with hiring diverse candidates, but it's also a function of their network. Because if you look around and go, well, I knew everybody, or everybody at least is only 1 degree of separation, that tells you something. So it means you have to intentionally expand your network. And so that when there's 1 degree of separation when you're finding candidates, is because you intentionally expanded your network. So, and the work needs to be done now, not when you need to make the hire. You should just actively start doing that now. Like, oh, I went to certain events. I would support the Black Chamber, or they had Pride Month, so I went to that event. Like, that's how you create and start expanding your network. And if you do that work now, when it comes time to hire, it'll happen more naturally, it'll be easier.
Okay. How should businesses think about the difference between virtue signaling and meaningful speech on diversity issues?
Yeah, that's good. So that's good. This person is deep, right? So I think part of it is we got to think of our mission and vision. And when you put out statements, is it consistent with your mission and vision? And I always say audio has to match video. So if you say you're committed to something and I can't see it in your store, then it's pretty clear what you're doing is going to feel inconsistent and disingenuous. And so I really think it's important to just do the simple things up front and think about, okay, does the store reflect this commitment? Do the things we do when we do make statements, do we do it consistently? Is it consistent with our mission and vision? Because a lot of times people say, oh, diversity is important to me, and I celebrate Black History Month, but Pride comes along and we don't do anything. Right? Audio doesn't match visual. These things are inconsistent. If you're committed to diversity, you got to be consistent. And I always tell people, you should identify the month you're going to celebrate and advertise that, and so everyone knows. And that way they know. And then there should be, like, for us, there's tons of different heritage months. And we usually try to identify the ones that are federally recognized. It's in actually one of the documents that I shared with everyone. And that's the reason we did it. So we can say, this is why we don't celebrate everyone, because you don't have limited resources. You can't cover everyone. But if you're upfront about the ones you do, and it looks like it aligns with your mission and vision, it makes the whole thing so much simpler, because you can say, look, I got limited resources, not that we don't care, but these are ones that we felt like we could support. It reflects our vision and mission, our commitment to our community. That's why we chose these.
Okay, so we're going to take one last question and then wrap it up. How do you do the kind of tracking for who you're reaching when you're online without a physical space? especially with no budget and not a lot of technological genius?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think the hard part there is it's hard to know who you're reaching. And I guess that's the question, like, how do you know? And I think the only thing you can do in that situation, and I'm no expert in this space, obviously, on everything there is to do with diversity and the internet. But I think if you can still know this is our definition, this is our mission and vision, and we try to hold consistently to those, and we see things reflected on our website. When people do interact with us, it looks like the community that we're trying to serve and the community we're trying to reach. Those are the things you can actually control. And then hopefully through that, you get the return. I think with McDonald's, I don't think they knew there was going to be a riot and didn't plan for a riot. But they tried to hold to their values, and they stated what their values are. And they tried to make sure it was reflected in the community, in their organization, who got hired, who got promoted, who stayed. And therefore, hopefully you get that. You can start reaching the demographic you're trying to reach.
Okay, well, thank you for your time, Jason. Do you have any closing remarks for anyone?
Well, I just want to thank everybody. Hopefully this was helpful. I know that I tend to be overly practical, but everything I covered is in the book. You'll get handouts. If you know how to reach me, I'm happy to answer questions. And I enjoy doing that. So if there's something I can do, just let me know. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!